We spend years screaming over who sits in the Oval Office. Red versus blue, left versus right. Cameras flash, crowds roar, and every 4 years we're told this election is the most important of our lifetime. But while we fight over the puppet on stage, nobody looks at the hands pulling the strings. Watch a $100 bill get printed. Who authorized that money to exist? It's not the president, not Congress, and not anyone you voted for. The most powerful institution in America has never appeared on a ballot. It pays dividends to private shareholders. It has never been fully audited. If you don't control the currency, budgets, wars, then bailouts are just negotiations with whoever does. If you want to know who actually holds the lever, hit subscribe. Because the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world his bank was a government agency. The name itself is the first lie. Open any government directory and you won't find the Federal Reserve listed alongside the Treasury or the IRS. That's because the 12 regional reserve banks aren't government agencies, they're private corporations with their own balance sheets, their own boards, and shareholders collecting profits every year. The word federal works like a costume. It signals public trust while hiding a legal structure that looks nothing like the agencies Americans actually vote to fund. Here's how the ownership works. Under the Federal Reserve Act, every national bank in the district must purchase shares in its regional reserve bank. This isn't optional. To operate as a member bank, you buy in. The law requires stock purchases equal to 6% of paid-up capital and surplus. This ownership stake is permanent, documented, and legally binding. Now consider this. Where does this money come from? You see, the system doesn't receive congressional appropriations. It doesn't wait for budget approval. It pays its own salaries, funds its own security, throws its own conferences, all from revenues generated by its own operations. If Congress doesn't write the check, Congress doesn't control the checkbox. The details are buried in Regulation 1 and ends document in the Code of Federal Regulations at 12 CFR Part 209. It governs how ownership gets issued, how it gets cancelled, and how dividends flow to the private banks holding shares. This is a network of corporations with private member bank stockholders embedded at the core of America's monetary system. The legal structure is documented. The corporate ownership is real. The name Federal Reserve signals public accountability, while the machinery operates outside normal democratic oversight. The public bears all macro risk, private banks receive fixed returns and special legal protections. That's the deal codified in federal statute. Once you understand the engine runs this way, one question becomes terrifying. Who designed it? And why did they insist the design happen in absolute secrecy? That's what we're about to find out. November 1910th. 6 men board a private train car in New Jersey under fake names. Their destination, the Jekyll Island Club, an exclusive retreat off the coast of Georgia owned by America's wealthiest families. Their mission, draft a plan to control the nation's money supply. Think of it as a heist, movie in reverse. Usually people break into banks to steal money. These men broke into a private island to create the bank that would steal for them. The Federal Reserve's own historical records name the architects: Senator Nelson Aldrich, whose daughter married into the Rockefeller dynasty, Assistant Treasury Secretary A. Piatt Andrew representing government interest, Henry Davidson from JPMorgan's inner circle, Frank Vanderlip, president of National Citibank, Paul Warburg, partner at the investment house Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and Arthur Shelton, Aldrich's personal secretary. They called themselves the First Name Club. No last names allowed. If a servant overheard Senator Aldrich discussing banking reform with Mr. Morgan's partner, the entire operation would collapse. The American public would never accept a monetary system designed by the same banking dynasties they blamed for financial panics. For 9 days, these men drafted what became known as the Aldrich Plan, a central reserve association that would control America's currency and credit. The secrecy was absolute. Participants denied the meeting ever happened until the 1930s, more than 2 decades later. And the timing of what followed was just as calculated. The Federal Reserve Act passed Congress on December 23, 1913. While most representatives had already left Washington for the Christmas holiday, a skeleton crew voted the banking system into existence. Think about that. The framework controlling every dollar in your wallet today was written on a private island, then passed into law when almost nobody was watching. The architects chose Jekyll Island specifically because it was isolated enough to avoid public scrutiny. They chose Christmas Eve specifically because opposition would be minimal. The blueprint was complete. Now it needed a home, a place where policy announcements become market reality. 12 Federal Reserve banks exist on paper, scattered from Boston to San Francisco, but only one sits directly on top of Wall Street. Only one controls the machinery that actually moves money through the system: the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. This bank operates the trading desk, the operational nerve center of monetary policy. When the Federal Open Market Committee decides to expand or contract the money supply, the New York desk executes those orders. It buys and sells securities, it adjusts interest rate conditions, it coordinates with a select group of primary dealers who serve as mandatory counterparties. When policy announcements make headlines, the trading desk makes them real. Trillions of dollars flow through this single node every year. So who owns it? Well, a Freedom of Information Act request pulled back the curtain on this. The share ledger from year-end 2018 reads like a controlled chart, not a broad-based public institution. Citibank held 87.9 million shares, 42.8% of total stock. JPMorgan Chase Bank held another 60.6 million shares, representing 29.5%. Two banks, together they control 72.3% of America's most operationally powerful reserve bank. So while Congress debated whether you deserved the $1,200 stimulus check, the New York Fed clicked the button and funneled $29 trillion to the same institutions. No debate, no vote, no news coverage. The closed loop is complete. The banks that own the Fed are the same banks the Fed bails out. Now look at where those banks came from. Citibank traces its lineage to National Citibank, the institution run by Frank Vanderlip, one of the 6 men who drafted the blueprint on Jekyll Island. JPMorgan descends from the house of JPMorgan, whose partner Henry Davidson sat in the same room. The dynasties that designed the system in 1910 still own the node that executes it today. The trading desk isn't merely located near Wall Street, it's embedded inside Wall Street, owned by the very institutions whose fortunes rise and fall with every policy decision the desk carries out. But ownership alone doesn't explain why these banks keep showing up for more. The real draw is what shareholders receive, a return so reliable it's guaranteed by statute. Section 7 of the Federal Reserve Act spells it out in black and white. After the reserve banks cover their expenses, stockholders are entitled to an annual dividend on paid-in capital stock. This stock can't be sold or traded on any exchange, but the guaranteed returns never stop, and the entitlement is cumulative. If the Fed can't pay 1 year, the obligation doesn't disappear. It stacks. For the largest member banks, the dividend rate is capped at either 6% or the yield on the most recent 10-year Treasury auction, whichever is lower. But even at the reduced tier, this is guaranteed income written into federal law. No matter what happens to the economy, member banks get paid first. That payment order tells you everything you need to know. In January 2016, the Fed reported estimated net income of $100.2 billion for the prior year. Of that, $97.7 billion went to the US Treasury. Sounds like the public wins. But statutory dividends totaling $1.7 billion flowed to the member bank shareholders before Treasury saw a dime. Then the system started bleeding. Between 2022 and 2023, the Fed's aggressive rate hikes caused its own interest expenses to explode. Payments on bank reserves exceeded what the Fed was earning. Every time interest rates climb and your mortgage gets more expensive, the Fed's income increases, ensuring those dividends keep flowing. Call it the tax on the American dream, if you will. Then in March 2024, the Fed released its audited financials. Expenses exceeded earnings by $114.3 billion in 2023 alone. Any normal institution would call this a loss. The Fed doesn't. Instead, it created something called a deferred asset, an accounting entry that tracks how much the Fed must earn before remittances to Treasury resume. By the end of 2023, that figure hit $133.3 billion. As of late 2024, it ballooned past $221 billion and keeps climbing. Independent estimates put this total taxpayer cost at $1.6 trillion, covered through inflation while dividends still flow to shareholders. The deferred asset is a pause button. It lets the Fed avoid the political headline that it's losing money while the public absorbs the cost through inflation and higher borrowing rates. Member banks still collect their dividends, Treasury waits. So what does a system built this way actually do to you? Not in theory, in the way your life gets priced, your debt gets trapped, and your vote gets reduced to theater. A country can vote on everything except the terms of its own money. That's how you get democracy on the surface and discipline underneath. Mortgage approvals, job cycles, small business credits that appears and vanishes based on decisions made in rooms you'll never enter, rent hikes that arrive like weather, layoffs framed as necessary medicine. The deferred asset grows while your purchasing power shrinks. The dividend flows while your wages stagnate. The system runs exactly as designed. The power doesn't sit with the people you voted for. It doesn't sit with the one party or the other. It sits in the room where the monkey button lives, in the hands of bankers you didn't elect and cannot remove. The Federal Reserve is the only machine in history that can print its own fuel, set its own price, and charge you for the privilege of using it. You vote for politicians who must ask the Fed for money, and the Fed is owned by private banks. So if the system is designed to trap you, how do you escape? In the next video, I'm going to show you the anti-CBDC portfolio, the specific assets they cannot freeze, track, or delete. The only way to opt out of a system designed on a private island 113 years ago to harvest your labor. Drop a comment with the moment that made your stomach drop. Like and subscribe for more investigations where the receipts are public, but the truth stays buried.